introduction. Thank you so much. Trying not to cry.
I am too. I was like, don't do it.
You're very emotional. Thank you.
I really appreciate your coming so far. And this moment is, I think, important to me, but to a lot of other people. We're recording this session too and hope to share it far and wide. Just to dial back to the beginning, how did period poverty catch your attention, and how is it that it ended up on your political agenda?
Well, again, thank you for having me here. It's a real honour to be here and a huge fan of
Let's scoot you, because I'm obsessed with
Oh,
the letters on your face.
Right,
So I wanna
okay,
just
let's do that.
Just a tiny bit. There. Then you won't have my name on your face.
Perfect.
I'll get comfortable. Well, you said in introduction I was elected in 2016, and for at least 5 years before that we'd had a change of government in the United Kingdom, and the government was pursuing austerity agenda. So we were seeing quite serious cuts to public services, to welfare, and people's wages weren't going up. It's a lot worse now, but even then we could see that more people were in poverty, more people who were working were struggling to meet their needs. So we had this explosion of food banks everywhere, even in towns and communities that didn't traditionally fit the bill of being a deprived area or a lower income area. But going for the door of a food bank is quite a big step for people to take, because you're right, there's such a stigma around poverty. So we had lots of data about the impact of poverty, the impact of austerity, but increasingly I was listening to think tanks and anti-poverty groups who were saying this is having a disproportionate impact on women and girls. So that was being recognised, but no one was really coming up with policies or measures to tackle that. So fast forward, I get elected, I become a politician, and realise, well, I now have the privilege of having a platform in Scotland's Parliament where I can ask questions and also can propose solutions and legislation. So started off by asking questions. I asked a lot of questions in Parliament,
And you're in the opposition.
So want to be constructive in that role as well, not just to criticise the government and say they're doing everything bad. So anyway, ask some questions around periods, menstruation, what work is government doing to look at the accessibility and affordability of menstrual products, because if more and more people are having to go to food banks to get basic items to feed themselves, their children, what's happening with other items that people have to buy on a regular basis. So it won't surprise you that the government came back and said, we're doing no work on this whatsoever. Probably they were thinking, what is she talking about, periods? Because it's always been seen as an individual problem, and it's not polite to talk about it. Certainly not in Parliament.
Company.
No one in Parliament was talking about periods. So government came back and admitted there was no research, no data, no nothing, and there was some welfare support for people who were really financially struggling, and food banks exist. But food banks shouldn't exist. Poverty shouldn't exist. Poverty is not inevitable. So that was a bit of a light bulb moment for me, that
no one was really doing anything about it.
Yeah, and that status quo wasn't acceptable. So I started to speak to other organisations, including charities, trade unions, teachers, because education is a big theme today, and it was great to hear the earlier presentation, because in Scotland what teachers were telling me those 7 years ago was that period poverty is real, but we just bring extra pads to school and give them to our pupils.
So it's coming out of their
It's coming out of their pocket, and their wages hadn't been going up to keep up with the cost of living. So that was really the starting point, but bringing together, you know, well, who knows about this? You know, we don't have the data, but let's hear the experience. So teachers were really key, the people who run the women's shelters, people who run the food banks, and we then packaged that together and did some media, because you know the media can be a pain but also can be a real ally, and especially when you can get campaigning journalists involved. So that's when we started to talk about period poverty, which, you know, can be quite a stigmatised sentence in itself,
Yeah.
but it got people's attention.
You're elected for the first time, and you're standing in Parliament, and you're thinking to yourself, well, I'm going to start talking about pads an awful lot as, well, in the US you'd say a freshman member of Parliament. What is the thinking that, I mean, I understand the larger issues of poverty, but was there a light bulb moment for you where you thought, this is the in on matters of poverty that I'm going to take?
Yeah, I mean, the poverty aspect was a big motivation, but also it was about periods can be unpredictable, they can be messy, you can just start to have menstrual bleeds when you're not expecting it. So, you know, the vision was about, you know, we have to normalise this. You know, your tagline today around just like toilet paper, and if we normalise it, then you know we create that dignity for everyone, and it's not about this is an initiative, you know, for people in poverty. It's for everyone. So the debate was initially centred around people in lower income and people who really cannot provide, you know, the basic you know, level of products that they need for health and well-being. But then it was like, let's have a wider conversation, because there is taboo, there is stigma, people are embarrassed, young people are not getting the education that they need and deserve, and we just don't have problems for the future. So it felt like, yeah, we need some intervention and some investment from government, but actually this is preventative spend. It's going to be good for public health, people will get a better education, people will perform better at work, we could reduce sickness absence at work, because we had examples of young people in school not being in classroom because they were worried about having their period in school, or people having to take time off work because we had mothers going without menstrual products to give them to their daughters.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I mentioned is people underestimate the impact. And part of that too that we found when some university students were taking our survey in Amsterdam, one of them said to me it was the first time that she realized that she herself experienced period poverty, because she hadn't thought of it that way. She had thought of period poverty as something that's the most extreme, and that's easy. I mean, we also try to help people who are in the worst possible states of poverty, but it's a very wide range, and opening this conversation and normalizing it helps people realize that they aren't alone, and they're sometimes having to make tough choices between, do they get, you know, the groceries, you know, all the groceries they want, or all the school supplies they need, or whatever that month, or do they make sure they have enough of a supply? And that choice is so automated in an individual way in us that we forget to identify that as, this is a structural issue I'm struggling with. And this too is period poverty. And then that means that it's also not necessarily, you know, under the poverty line at that extremity. So bringing it up in that way, yeah, it's extraordinary. And also coming from the space from Scotland, from, you know, in this manner was so galvanizing for so many people. But I think with your gentle voice, we may have a sense that this kind of came along more smoothly than people anticipate. I think with the kind of work that I've done, the struggle is real. Can you describe some of the biggest challenges that you faced?
Anyone comes forward with a policy or a proposition and it hasn't been done before, it hasn't been tested, because in politics, you know, governments are risk averse.
They're what?
they don't like to take
Oh,
big
risk
risks.
averse,
Yeah.
yes, yeah, sorry.
Because if it goes badly wrong, they'll get bad headlines and there'll be a public backlash. And because Scotland couldn't say, well, okay, has it worked okay in other countries? So that was the unknown. But to me, that was, you know, that was all the more reason to do it, that Scotland could really excel and show that this is a progressive idea, but it's really practical. It might sound radical, but it isn't really. You know, do we want people to be bleeding on chairs in the classroom and in the workplace? Of course we don't. So it was difficult to get Parliament time. When you're in opposition, you can't just turn up in Parliament and stand up and talk about whatever you want. There are processes. But I think also because I was just a freshman, because I was new, I maybe didn't realise all the different conventions and unwritten rules in Parliament, and probably because I didn't know that, I just steamed ahead and thought, no, we have to do it.
With a certain kind of innocence of why not.
Yeah, and I had to, I think I was speaking to you earlier on when we had a cup of tea, and I said, you know, I had to get other Parliament colleagues to sign the motion.
You should describe the whole
for
story.
debate. Yeah, well, you have to get a certain number of MSPs from a range of parties to sign the motion. So in 20 years, the Parliament had never discussed menstruation. There'd been some discussion about menstrual products washing up on the beach and causing litter and environmental harm, but there was no discussion about women or people who menstruate and the sort of health side of it. So I had to ask colleagues, will you sign this so we can get a debate in Parliament? And people were a bit indifferent, and
normally you do it electronically, and you went around talking to people and looking them in the eyes.
Well, I realised they were just ignoring the email, so I just got a bundle of products, and you know, I won't mention the brands, but a variety of tampons and pads and boxes, and just walked about Parliament, say, hey, you know, to colleagues, have you signed this yet? You know that your constituents, people who live in your town, they need these products and they can't get them, and you know, we can do something about it. And the men would go redder and redder. So yeah, one of the tactics was just to embarrass people and to say to, you know,
if I sign, she'll stop talking to me.
Yeah, I think that was part of it. She'll go away and we can go on to other more serious business. But you know, menstruation is serious. And it's not just about a woman's issue, it is about the economy, it is about our society. So there was lots of milestones and lots of good things that happened, but one of the interesting things, so the Parliament, the Scottish Parliament, you know, the building that we're in was opened in 2003. It's a lovely building, a place to work, nice place to work. But for some of the staff who work there, they were saying, you know, we're getting to that stage of being perimenopausal, and periods, you know, become a bit ridiculous and unpredictable. So they had an issue, just to warn people, so they had an issue that the machines in Parliament, like a vending machine, you had to have certain type of money and a coin, and because of the job that they do, they didn't always have the correct money, and the products in the machines were quite basic. So we had an idea that we could just get, you know, replace the machines and have a basket and just have a range of products for free.
So that you didn't have to mess about with finding the right coins or
absolutely.
not.
And then that was the approach that was taken. Again, someone mentioned about pioneers, and you know, you need those early adopters. So the education space was really important. So my local college said, we'll do this. Dundee University, North Ayrshire, so they're municipal council, they have 9 high schools, and small enough that they could test it out, but really importantly they co-designed the scheme with young people, rather than a top-down approach from government, and they brought it in for initially for the secondary schools, or the high schools, and then the primary schools. But once they had allowed that to bed in, they went into the community, and that was like your libraries and your community centres. So we did it in stages until we eventually got the legislation But the legislation part is really important because you can have really good policy and you can have like short-term projects,
Yeah.
but you need to get that sustainable funding. And with your election cycle, you can have a really good minister at a national level who's really supportive, but they might lose their seat at the next election. So we didn't want to leave it to chance. But just to go back a step, so we had to do obviously a lot of public consultation to take the legislation through Parliament. And the main thing that people talked about was it had to be universal. People didn't want means testing, didn't want people who menstruate to have to prove their income
Yeah.
or their status or describe how many products they might need and
Because
what's a
that
normal
also
period for
goes
them.
back
Yeah.
into that stigma and that taboo and that discomfort too. Just simply make it an option that's available for anyone who needs it without the questions, without those hurdles.
Yeah, and then you remove the bureaucracy and the administration, keep it really straightforward. So we have a situation now in Scotland where, if you're in school or college education, so like a building like this, you would walk into the bathroom and the free menstrual products are there. So if you just need to have one, you take that, but if you need to take products home, no one's going to police that or question you
Right.
about that. The student unions and the university college management completely on board. Now they have to be by law, but they also do fantastic initiatives like for the holiday periods, when you're on vacation, when you're not in school, you can take products away. And now the local government, the municipal government, there's a duty on them and they have to have a scheme. So it might look different if you live in Glasgow or you live in an island in Scotland or the Highlands. So it might look a bit different depending on where you are in the country. But there's an app that you can download for your phone. So if you have an iPhone or a smartphone, and you just put in your postcode or zip codes.
And it shows you the locations.
So yeah, anywhere you are in the country. And what's really cool about it, because you mentioned that I'm also passionate about sustainability as well as social justice, is that if plastic-free products are available or reusable products, the app will also have that information. So we want people to have choice in a range of products, but the more that we have a public conversation about menstruation, the more we can talk about sustainability and making sure that we have products that are not needlessly harming the environment as well. So I'm really excited about that, and so yeah, people in Scotland, when they were consulted, said we want a universal scheme that's about dignity and equality, and for that to be intersectional as well. So some people got a bit upset with me that the legislation, so when you write legislation, people who draft bills and lawyers are obviously involved in that process, but you need the bill or the act to then be future-proofed so that the language doesn't quickly become out of date. And so for me, women and girls clearly benefit from the legislation and people who menstruate, but being able to access the product, for example, you might want to access the product, but you might have a partner or a carer who would go and collect the products for you. So we wanted the bill to be written in a gender neutral way, but some people got upset about that. So again, these challenges come up, but to go from having no legislation and no free period products to having that universally available for anyone who needs them, no questions asked. It is an amazing achievement, and I'm really proud of everyone in Scotland who was part of that. But I suppose when any change is proposed,
There's going to be resistance.
you will have some resistance, and some people who feel you're not doing it properly, and why are you doing it that way? But I think was it Katerina in the presentation talked about patience. I agree with that to a point, because good menstrual health policy has been missing from public life and from governments forever. And patience, you know, it's, you know, people want women, when we ask for things, they want us to be nice and polite about it and not to cause a stir. And I'm glad that colleagues in Scotland eventually all agreed, but it wasn't always like that.
No. And I think what you're talking about too, when you're doing something for the first time, when you're doing something and you're trying to future-proof it, there's going to be resistance because you're going against what is the status quo. When we have our menstruation stations around the city in Amsterdam, we put some of them on the street. We try to encourage people to take what they need, which means whole packets, because we don't want them to feel like they can only take one. Just take actually what you need. This is a normal thing. When we put them indoors, when possible, we put them in hallways so that, because we know that not everybody, people are using different bathrooms, and we want to make it visible. We want to send a message about this being an issue and allow people to make that choice on their own. So having it in these ways helps sort of reduce some of that. And then there are objections that come up. Do you ever get issues about people saying, well, if this is available for everybody, they're going to, you know, people are going to ransack the stock or whatever?
Oh yeah. I mean, I totally agree that the visibility is really important. When the legislation was making its way through Parliament, some concerns were raised that this would be abused, people would be stockpiling tampons, and people in school would be sticking the pads on the wall, and
what was your answer to that?
You know, there would be riots. Well, I just kind of ask people to calm down. Really, we had a situation, so because I'm based in Scotland and we're part of the United Kingdom, so the Scottish Parliament has devolved responsibility on many, many issues, including health and education, and some issues are reserved to the UK Parliament. But initially the Scottish Government had a list of objections, so they said, you know, we agree with the sentiment behind this, they're really good principles, but, you know, here are all the things that you haven't considered, here's what could go wrong. And one of the concerns that they had was that people would cross the border from England to come and take Scotland's tampons and beauty products. So the media got a bit excited, and there was a headline about cross-border tampon raids. So people were thinking about Braveheart and all sorts of things. So it just got a bit silly, but actually because that was such a ridiculous objection, people laughed, and then the government got really embarrassed, and everyone thought, oh, you know, we just have to make this happen. So we got to a stage where one by one political parties signed up to the bill, and then in Scotland it's the Scottish National Party at the time. Nicola Sturgeon was the First Minister, so it also looked a bit odd that we had a woman in government projecting a really progressive image, you know, left of centre image to the world, but her party was the only party standing in the way of the bill, because even the Conservative Party, who are right wing, had agreed to back it. So there was a bit of a journey there. But yeah, you know, we've been doing this in Scotland now, probably from 2017, you know, the very local examples, the pilot schemes, and then it's gone national. Even before the legislation was finally voted on, the provision in the schools and colleges and universities had been rolled out. So we had a lot of practice to look at, and you know, we weren't seeing any problems at all. I think in some schools there have been some incidents where there have been some silly stunts in the toilets, but there's a real issue. You know, young people get a hard time. I do a lot of visits in schools. I'm working on another piece of legislation right now around the climate and nature emergency. And even now in school, you know, young people have to ask permission to go to the bathroom, and I've heard young people being told off, why didn't you go at the break time? Why didn't you go in your lunchtime? And there's so many hidden disabilities. Some young people get bullied in school. So we create a lot of anxiety around toilet breaks. And it's like, if someone needs to go to the bathroom, let's trust them. If they're going to be involved in something inappropriate, we'll deal with that later, but let's not embarrass young people when they need to go to the toilet. So we still have a situation, well, not now, but we had a situation where the school had emergency supplies of period products in the office, or there might be a school nurse, don't have so many of them now. But asking permission to go to the bathroom and then having to go and find a member of staff to give you the period product. So what's really good now is that we're linking it with education. So we have some schools in my region where, for example, one group's called Code Red, and similar to yourself, they do talks in assembly. They encourage students to take the products home, just to create this narrative in the school. So that's led by the young people, but what is really important is making sure that regardless of where you live and regardless of your school zip code, that everyone gets that high quality menstrual health and wellbeing education. So what we're trying to do is encourage the government to build that into the curriculum, to make that mandatory, but that should be designed, co-designed with young people themselves. And I really agree that having another young person come in who's relatable and can make that conversation accessible is really important. But it would be a real shame if some schools could afford to do that and others couldn't. So that issue about funding is really key.
I think so too, and I think the other part too is that real change does certainly involve everyone and should happen from the ground up. And I've spoken with high school students who have come to us asking for help because they go to their principal and they say, we'd like to have this, and then the principal says, yeah, well, what if somebody's going to put them all on the walls? My answer to that was, so it happens once. This is not a glamorous item, and once they've had their fun and you put it all away, you continue, because just because one person is going to mess it up doesn't mean everyone should lack access. And the other contention too is, kids' period poverty isn't an issue in this school. Look, there's some scooters outside. This is not a problem. And it's so sad to have to, to put, in this case, a 15-year-old student in a position of having to come up with the ammunition to come up against the resistance at the school. So having options of people who can talk about this in an accessible way and to help those students along is really enormous. And that example of what you're describing happening in Scotland now is so powerful. But in the context of all of this, do you feel like period poverty is a thing of the past now in your country?
I would never be as complacent to say the job is done. Legislation is crucial, but alongside that we need to have culture change. I think the legislation and the campaigning around that has helped to change the conversation, and we are seeing culture change. But we now have the legislation in Scotland that came into full legal effect only in August of last year. So although a lot of the provision was in place for the local government, the municipal government, that just came into force in August of last year. So it's quite early. So what I'm encouraging all of my colleagues to do is to make sure that their communities know how they can access the products, to let people know it is universal, it is free, you can take as much as you need. And if you want to take them home for friends and family, you can do that. No one's going to count or tell you off. But the cost of living pressures are so serious. You mentioned the energy crisis. The people who are going to food banks now, many of them are people who are working. Some of them are teachers. Some of them are in really, serious serious,
And
well-paid
they haven't
jobs,
seen pay rises
and they
in
haven't.
forever.
So it's a real struggle. There's a big role here for employers. So in Scotland, we couldn't put a duty on employers into the bill. That would have to be the UK government who does that. But we can work through the trade unions and through pay negotiations to encourage employers to do the right thing. It makes business sense. I think it's a smart thing to do, and there are businesses and employers who are quite smart and quite savvy, and they want to show to prospective employees and to new talent that they value their workforce, they look after people, and it's such a small thing for a company to put period products into their washrooms. It's not a big expense, it's a small gesture. So you mentioned I was an urban planner before, so in Parliament I chair a group for construction industry, so bringing different leaders together, and part of that is to try and address some of the labour shortages for the construction industry. We're not going to address climate and net zero without growing that workforce and getting really skilled people, and to do that we need more women and more diverse people working in construction. So that's a good space to talk about
Make it more
menstrual
appealing
health
to
and
a more
wellbeing.
diverse workforce.
Yeah. So the more you have the conversation, the reaction is actually really positive, and people. So it's like last night, some of us met in the pub, and some of the bars locally in Utrecht are now saying, yeah, we're going to have free period products. So bars, restaurants, gyms, sports clubs. In Scotland, the campaign involved football clubs, and Celtic Football Club in Glasgow, they're a massive club.
But how did they involve them?
Well, the fans approached the board. Some young women who spent a lot of money on their season ticket to support their club, and they approached the board and said, we want to have a conversation about period products. I think the board were probably scared to say no, because fan power is real, and they said, we want to talk about this. So you know that some people can't afford to buy period products, or people have travelled a long way to get to the stadium, and the toilets are not meeting their needs. So there was some backlash on social media. Some men, some cis men were saying, well, if you can afford a football ticket, you can afford to buy period products. But again, just not understanding menstruation at all.
The basics.
So Celtic became the first club to do it, and then it just spreads because people see good things happening. They want to be part of that as well. So it has been difficult. It was a challenging campaign. Very time consuming for me and my small team in Parliament, getting to know, how to be a member of Parliament, how does legislation work, and then obviously helping people on other issues. But there was a lot of goodwill and a lot of support, and it's like being here today, there's so much positive energy. People want to be part of something that's progressive and will help people.
So it kind of gets its own momentum.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also been able to see, well, what is happening in other countries, what really good practice is happening elsewhere. So for me, it's about the products. Absolutely, people need to have access to menstrual products, but what about the policies around that, in terms of if you are having really bad pain, or you have endometriosis, or you might need some time from work, do you have a flexible policy at work? We want people to know they shouldn't just suffer in silence as well.
Well, I think, you had mentioned earlier there's a limit to the utility of patience. I happen to be someone with a rather short supply of it, so looking at the
Me too.
situation in the Netherlands, it's felt very slow. We haven't really. I was hoping that all kinds of things were going to happen after you did what you did, and but they are happening now, even if it's in a slow, uneven kind of way. I know that on university campuses, a number of university campuses, at least in Amsterdam, but I think also here in Utrecht, there are struggles to get agreements from the administration to supply in any significant way. And so I think that you have a lot of different activists and like-minded politicians who are trying in their ways to make a difference, but it is still going slowly. What kind of, is there advice, whether it's for the Netherlands or any other country, if you could drill it down to maybe three bits of advice that are specific to dealing with this issue, what would you pass along to others who are still in the middle
Great
of
question.
it?
Well, first of all, well done, because the fact that you are making progress, even if it is patchy, that is to be celebrated, and that creates the momentum, because that also creates an evidence base, and you're very good at collecting data and telling people this is what's going on, and this is the, we can measure things, but if we're persuading government or other agencies to spend money and to make investment, having evidence is important. So what I can do, and colleagues in Scotland, is we can share, our journey. We can show the legislation and the guidance that underpins that, and we can put people in the Netherlands in touch with people in Scotland who deal with this as their day job, in terms of the people who purchase the products for universities. So in Scotland, the education sector has come together. So the universities and the colleges, they have working groups where they can say, right, rather than us all try to figure it out individually, purchasing and procurement, absolutely. So I think we have to, first of all, not frame it as an expense, but as an investment in the future. It's an investment in young people, it's an investment in women, it's how we help to eradicate poverty, it's how we try and become a more equal society. So the pooling of that knowledge and sharing of that knowledge is really important. I think also working with the media is key. Find journalists or newspapers or publications or broadcasters who will understand and perhaps have a bit of passion for the issue. Yep. So in Scotland, this became a very high profile issue, and having a good working relationship with the media was important.
Some allies in the media.
Yeah, and part of that, and you have to be careful about case studies and stories, because at the end of the day, if an individual wants to share their experience of period poverty or a struggle accessing period products, it can be quite a lot for that person to put themselves out there, because social media, people can be quite mean. So we need to be responsible, but we shouldn't just have to rely on people telling quite depressing stories all the time to prove there's a problem. So that's why the sort of research that you've been involved in, having the data is really important. So again, like Plan International had information for Scotland, but you do have to put a human face on it. Yeah. And you have to tell a story.
Balance.
It's about people. So doing that in a responsible way. So absolutely, learning from others who've done it, frame it as an investment, and working with the media and making sure that you are building a movement. I get a lot of credit for this, but I didn't do this on my own. For decades and generations before me, women in politics and out of the politics were having these conversations, we're fighting these battles. So there is that journey, and where I was able to get success in the mainstream of politics was, having the support from trade unions, from women's organisations, from LGBTQ plus organisations, building that solidarity, and just being really persistent, really annoying, really relentless. Social media really worked as well, because it gave people a platform, because there was no, how can I describe it? Often in politics, big campaigns have a lot of money and resource behind them, but this was very organic and grassroots. So I didn't have a campaign partner or a donor, so we had to do a lot
To be creative.
with little, and social media was really important.
Well, I mean, in our case too, I mean, we didn't have the funds to commission a study. We weren't in that kind of position. We're a very small organization. We depend entirely on donations. But we were approached by the research firm, because they had done period poverty research before in the UK, and they wanted to do it pro bono. And so we thought about when we would do the study, because we wanted to time it in a period that would be the period where a bill might be submitted to the local council. And within 2 weeks, so because we knew we had been working on a draft proposal for some time, and it just sort of been sitting, sort of waiting for something to happen, waiting for enough support. And within 2 weeks of our report study hitting the newspapers, the bill was introduced. And it is a timing thing. And I think that you had mentioned that earlier. Excuse me, my throat, I should have had some water. You'd mentioned that earlier when we were talking about alignment and about seeing opportunities, that it's a combination of working hard, being persistent, but also the capacity that you've demonstrated to find those opportunities and pull them all together and make them work for you.
Yeah, I think that what you said earlier about being strategic and having that plan. So for me, I could have compromised earlier on when government were talking about, well, we can't do this for everyone, we have to slim it down, perhaps if we have to target it. So I could have agreed to that, you know, a number of years earlier, but thank you so much. But the public consultation said, no, we don't want means testing, we want it to be universal, we want this to be dignified. So that was a red line. I said to government, no, it has to be universal. But you're right, there are different threads, different levers. Sometimes you need a bit of luck as well. I go back to that point about the headlines about the cross-border tampon raids, because that became so ridiculous and politicians were being ridiculed over it. Really sort of leaned into that. Well, I didn't actually have to say anything, I just sat back and thought, okay, we'll take this, but also you create your own luck sometimes as well. But in our situation, the pandemic plus an election coming up, it's like we have a window here, we just have to do this, let's stop all the nonsense. And I think sometimes it's like getting women in a room, you know, we're busy, we're stressed, we've got lots of hats that we wear, it's like we don't have time to grandstand on this and score points, so let's just do it. So for me, it's always about getting more women into politics and more women into positions of power, whether that's in government or in politics or in the boardroom. You know, we need women to be present everywhere where decisions are made. Absolutely. About us. So representation does absolutely matter, but also I think campaigns should be fun. So, you know, you keep people motivated by keeping it fun, people feeling that they're part of it. So yeah, I mean, I've learned a lot about it. I mean, we're coming up to the election in May 2021, and I thought, well, if I don't get re-elected and I look back on the last 5 years and think, well, did I achieve anything? Did I make an impact? Did we collectively make an impact? Then I thought, well, at least there's something I can be proud of. But now I'm thinking, well, what will I do next? You know, my first term was universal free period products, first in the world. So there's now that pressure to do.
But I mean, I think that's
equally
kind of a luxury position to have. You were kind of known around the world all of a sudden. And I know that we can really continue this conversation in a whole bunch of directions, because women in politics and representation is a whole other issue, as well as questions around sustainability. But I think this might be a good moment to sort of open it up to everybody else who's joined us today, so that we can maybe take some questions